You have to understand something fundamental about how the world actually works, because what you're seeing right now is not reality, it's a delayed reaction. We are currently standing in the eerily quiet and deceptive space between the blinding flash of a catastrophic explosion and the inevitable bone-crushing arrival of its physical shockwave. Right now, you can look out your window, you can look at the financial markets, you can look at the gas pump down the street, and everything appears to be functioning entirely within normal parameters. The grocery store shelves remain fully stocked. The electricity grid keeps the lights turned on, and the daily monotonous rhythm of global commerce hums along as if the foundational bedrock of our modern civilization is completely secure and unshakable. This profound disconnect between perception and underlying mathematical truth is the great macroeconomic illusion of our time. Most people operating in the economy today suffer from a deeply ingrained, highly dangerous normalcy bias, foolishly assuming that simply because the complex global system hasn't visibly broken down yet, it somehow possesses an infinite magical resilience. But this prevailing calm is not actual stability. It is merely a rapidly evaporating temporal buffer. What we are collectively facing with the impending unavoidable Iran oil shock is not just another standard cyclical market fluctuation, nor is it a fleeting geopolitical headline that will simply fade away into the background noise within a week or two. We are currently staring straight down the barrel of a historic, profoundly systemic 20% global energy supply shock that is absolutely going to fundamentally break the underlying delicate mechanics of international trade and human survival. When an economic event of this unprecedented magnitude actually occurs, the resulting destruction does not propagate through the system instantaneously. Instead, it moves through the highly complex, interconnected global economy, much like a massive tsunami traveling through deep ocean water, completely invisible and silent from the surface, yet carrying a catastrophic, world-altering payload of concentrated kinetic energy that will only finally reveal its true destructive power when it violently crashes into the shallow shoreline of the consumer market. To truly grasp exactly why this impending scenario is so incredibly dangerous to your personal livelihood, you absolutely have to stop thinking about global crude oil as just another generic commodity that occasionally makes your morning commute slightly more expensive. Oil is the ultimate master resource of human civilization. It is the literal physical blood of the entire global economic system. Every single solitary calorie of food you consume at your dinner table, every highly complex microchip embedded in your digital devices, every molded piece of plastic you touch, and every single raw material transported across the vast oceans is entirely subsidized by the continuous, uninterrupted flow of cheap, abundant fossil fuel energy. When you suddenly disrupt the primary, beating heart of energy production in the Middle East, specifically targeting the massive daily output and the highly vulnerable transit choke points controlled by Iran, you are not just playfully tweaking the speculative price of a barrel of crude on a trading terminal. You are aggressively initiating a permanent structural collapse of the entire global supply chain architecture. But here's the key insight that the mainstream financial media absolutely refuses to explain to you. The primary reason you do not physically feel the excruciating pain of this disruption immediately is entirely because of exactly how our convoluted financial plumbing is deliberately engineered. The global market system has artificially built-in shock absorbers that are specifically designed to intentionally mask temporary periods of volatility from the general public. We currently have massive government-controlled strategic petroleum reserves. We have extraordinarily complex, deeply financialized paper futures contracts, and we have a highly optimized, globalized inventory management system that artificially creates a temporary deceptive temporal buffer between the actual physical disruption of energy supply at the source and the eventual crushing economic suffering of the end consumer at the retail level. When the physical, tangible barrels of actual oil suddenly stop flowing out of the highly contested Strait of Hormuz, the global market initially absorbs that massive physical blow by rapidly draining down existing finite storage reserves and heavily relying on paper financial contracts that were previously negotiated and signed many months ago. This desperate stopgap mechanism creates a terrifying, rapidly widening divergence between the harsh physical reality of the actual world and the manipulated financial representation of that reality on Wall Street. It is exactly like a massive, sprawling metropolitan city suddenly running entirely out of fresh water at the primary reservoir. For the first few days after the reservoir completely runs dry, absolutely nobody in the city notices the impending doom because there is still residual water sitting in the underground pipes, there is still gravity-fed water slowly draining from the neighborhood water towers, and there is still a finite supply of bottled water sitting on the local grocery store shelves. The comforting psychological illusion of absolute abundance stubbornly persists in the minds of the population, even though the actual life-giving source of that abundance has been entirely and permanently severed. This terrifying scenario is exactly where we are sitting right now in the current macroeconomic cycle. The aggressive, highly coordinated policy interventions orchestrated by panicked central banks and desperate government officials over the past few years have only massively compounded and exacerbated this deeply embedded structural fragility. Instead of bravely allowing the financial system to naturally correct itself and forcing bloated, inefficient economies to painfully adapt to a stark lower energy reality, weak policymakers have artificially and aggressively suppressed market volatility at every single turn. They have recklessly drained critical strategic reserves strictly to manipulate retail gas prices ahead of crucial political election cycles. And they have irresponsibly flooded the global financial system with trillions of dollars in unbacked fiat liquidity simply to keep aggregate consumer demand artificially and unsustainably high. This cowardly strategy absolutely does not solve the underlying, terrifying physical shortage of actual energy. It merely creates a completely false, temporary sense of stability while simultaneously dramatically accelerating and amplifying the inevitable future economic pain. By artificially subsidizing endless consumer demand while physical energy supply remains tightly and structurally constrained by geopolitical realities, these policymakers have mathematically guaranteed that when this deceptive temporal buffer finally evaporates into nothingness, the resulting economic shockwave will be exponentially more destructive than anything we have ever witnessed in modern history. You simply cannot print physical barrels of crude oil out of thin air. You absolutely cannot solve a brutal physical supply shock with dovish monetary policy or lower interest rates. When a massive systemic 20% physical deficit forcefully hits the global energy market, the cold, unforgiving math of the situation strictly dictates that overall global consumption must immediately and violently fall by exactly 20% to match it. There is absolutely no alternative universe where this does not happen. Now layer onto that undeniable mathematical reality the true terrifying mechanism of exactly how this violent economic correction actually happens in the real world. Most ordinary people completely and utterly misunderstand this crucial concept. They mistakenly think entirely in terms of rising retail prices. They naively think that when global oil spikes to unprecedented highs, their local gas gets slightly more expensive, and maybe they just have to responsibly cut back on eating out at restaurants to successfully balance their monthly household budget. But that mindset is a fundamental catastrophic misunderstanding of how brutal, systemic, supply-driven inflation actually operates in a constrained environment. What we are absolutely about to experience on a global scale is not merely a frustrating pricing problem, it is a devastating existential capacity problem. This dark reality brings us directly to the sterile, highly academic concept of demand destruction. Demand destruction is a detached, emotionless macroeconomic term that wealthy economists casually use in comfortable boardrooms to mathematically describe a brutal, unforgiving, and highly destructive human reality. Millions of people and thousands of businesses being violently and permanently forced entirely out of the market simply because they can no longer financially afford to exist. When critical energy becomes universally scarce, the global economic system absolutely does not democratically or fairly distribute the resulting pain so that everyone simply suffers a little bit equally. Instead, the ruthless, hyper-efficient capitalist system aggressively and unapologetically allocates the rapidly dwindling remaining energy strictly to the absolute highest bidder, completely and utterly starving the lowest bidders of the basic resources they need to survive. In practical, real-world terms, this means massive industrial factories permanently shutting down their assembly lines, incredibly complex multinational supply chains suddenly breaking apart into useless fragments, and entire foundational industries abruptly becoming completely economically unviable overnight. It means that the essential nitrogen-based fertilizer absolutely required to successfully grow the global food supply suddenly becomes vastly too expensive to profitably produce, which directly and inevitably leads to massively lower agricultural crop yields and cascading horrific global food shortages. It means that the millions of highly vulnerable marginal small businesses that currently only manage to barely survive on razor-thin profit margins and the previously unquestioned assumption of cheap localized transportation costs are instantly and mercilessly wiped completely off the economic map. This impending scenario is not just standard cyclical inflation that you can simply budget your way out of. This is a permanent structural contraction of the entire global economy. Now let's talk very specifically about exactly how that brutal systemic correction actually manifests itself on the grand geopolitical global stage. We are currently rapidly moving away from a multi-decade, highly prosperous system of infinite global abundance and aggressively slamming directly into a dark, unforgiving system of brutal, zero-sum constraint. In a physically constrained world, international macroeconomics instantly becomes a highly aggressive, predatory, geopolitical game of raw survival. The wealthy, financially strong apex predator economies of the world absolutely do not just passively sit back and absorb the resulting economic pain. They aggressively leverage their massive financial weight to maliciously outbid the weaker developing economies, effectively and ruthlessly exporting their own domestic suffering to the most vulnerable populations on the planet. When heavily industrialized, energy-hungry regions like Western Europe or the United States suddenly face a massive, crippling domestic energy deficit, they will absolutely not hesitate to aggressively print money and gladly pay absolutely whatever exorbitant financial premium is necessary to rapidly secure massive, life-saving shipments of liquefied natural gas and heavy crude oil from the open global market. They will act like a massive, unstoppable vacuum, violently sucking absolutely all the available life-sustaining energy directly out of the global market to protect their own citizens. The inevitable, devastating second-order effects of this predatory geopolitical behavior are absolutely catastrophic for poorer, developing nations in the global south. Countries that simply cannot financially afford to pay the new, hyperinflated premium prices for basic energy will literally and figuratively go completely dark. We will actively witness cascading nationwide rolling blackouts, catastrophic sovereign debt defaults, hyperinflationary currency collapses, and the total irreversible collapse of basic industrial capacity in these weaker nations. This brutal global redistribution of extreme economic pain is entirely inevitable because the total absolute pool of universally available energy has permanently shrunk, and the powerful apex predators of the global economy will violently extract exactly what they desperately need to survive, callously leaving the rest of the vulnerable world to physically starve in the dark. This massive, unprecedented economic divergence will inevitably create a level of chaotic global geopolitical instability that we have not seen since the Second World War, directly triggering a highly destructive, unstoppable feedback loop of aggressive resource nationalism, panicked governmental export bans, and even further, devastating supply chain fracturing. Terrified countries will desperately hoard absolutely whatever finite physical resources they currently possess within their own borders, stubbornly refusing to trade with their neighbors, which will only serve to massively exacerbate the existing global shortage and violently drive international commodity prices even higher in a vicious, accelerating, inescapable death spiral. And here's the absolute final, most terrifying layer of this entire macroeconomic nightmare. This massive global macro-level catastrophe eventually, inevitably, and forcefully funnels directly down to the highly localized micro level, immediately and violently impacting your personal individual wealth, your specific career trajectory, and your own family's absolute physical and financial future. As this historic, unprecedented energy shock violently ripples through every single layer of the domestic economy, it will instantly trigger a massive, unavoidable tsunami of pure supply-driven inflation. But unlike the relatively mild, demand-driven inflation we previously experienced over the last few years, where consumers simply had far too much stimulus money mindlessly chasing slightly too few consumer goods, this new, highly destructive wave of inflation is driven purely and entirely by the exponentially escalating, unavoidable physical cost of basic production and global transport. The major central banks of the world will find themselves completely and utterly trapped in an impossible, unwinnable paradox. If they aggressively choose to significantly raise interest rates in a desperate, futile attempt to aggressively fight off this rampant supply-driven inflation, they will instantly and mercilessly crush absolutely whatever fragile remnants are left of the domestic consumer economy, drastically accelerating the massive incoming wave of corporate bankruptcies, massive real estate foreclosures, and catastrophic double-digit unemployment. Alternatively, if they cowardly choose to drastically lower interest rates and rapidly print trillions of new dollars in a pathetic attempt to artificially stimulate the dying economy, they will instantly and permanently destroy the fundamental purchasing power of the underlying fiat currency and violently send essential, life-sustaining commodity prices rocketing directly into the stratosphere. There is absolutely no magical escape hatch from this mathematical trap. The basic, unavoidable cost of daily human living will skyrocket to completely unimaginable heights at the exact same time that viable, wealth-generating economic opportunities rapidly and permanently vanish from the marketplace. Desperate, cash-starved companies will aggressively and mercilessly slash their domestic workforces to the absolute bone in a frantic attempt to mathematically offset their exponentially exploding, unavoidable operational energy costs. The once prosperous, comfortable middle class will be aggressively and systematically squeezed entirely out of existence, violently forced by necessity to rapidly liquidate their hard-earned life savings, their retirement accounts, and their physical assets for pennies on the dollar just to frantically cover the rapidly inflating basic necessities of daily survival. This terrifying paradigm shift is the ultimate permanent transition from a highly optimistic, growth-oriented economic system to a dark, brutal, survival-oriented economic system. The old, familiar rules that comfortably governed the past 4 highly prosperous decades of rapid globalization, easily accessible cheap credit, and highly optimized, just-in-time international supply chains are completely, undeniably, and permanently breaking down right in front of our eyes. We are rapidly entering a dark, highly volatile new era where personal, financial, and physical resilience is the absolute only metric that actually matters anymore. The deceptive, comforting current calm you are currently experiencing as you look around your neighborhood is the absolute, definitive final phase of the old, dying economic baseline. Every single day that peacefully passes by is exactly one day closer to the invisible temporal buffer permanently running completely dry. The massive, complex paper futures contracts will inevitably expire and demand physical delivery. The heavily depleted strategic petroleum reserves will rapidly and violently hit rock bottom. The stark, hidden, undeniable realities of the physically constrained global energy market will forcefully, aggressively, and violently assert themselves completely over the fragile, manipulated financial illusions we have collectively been living under for so long. This is absolutely not some wild, speculative, hypothetical doomsday scenario. It is a cold, hard, mathematical certainty driven entirely by the undeniable, immutable laws of physical supply and actual human demand in a strictly, physically constrained global world. If you take the time to study human economic history carefully and objectively, you will clearly see that every single major civilization-altering paradigm shift is always immediately preceded by a bizarre, extended period of eerie, deeply irrational public complacency, where the oblivious masses stubbornly and arrogantly refuse to believe that their comfortable modern standard of living can ever be permanently or meaningfully disrupted. They desperately, pathetically cling to their comfortable normalcy bias, precisely because the terrifying alternative reality is simply far too deeply uncomfortable and psychologically devastating to consciously acknowledge. But your willful, stubborn ignorance will absolutely not protect you or your family from the incoming physical shockwave. The entire highly leveraged global economy is absolutely about to violently hit a massive, immovable brick wall at absolute full speed, and the vast, overwhelming majority of everyday people are completely, utterly unbuckled, mindlessly staring down at their glowing smartphones, completely and blissfully unaware of the catastrophic, impending physical impact. The massive underlying structural energy deficit created by the sudden violent loss of Iranian energy output absolutely cannot be magically replaced by highly inefficient wind turbines, heavily subsidized solar panels, or the delusional, wishful, magical thinking of naive politicians. It is a massive, gaping, deeply structural hole violently blown directly into the very foundational bedrock of the global economy that will inevitably cause the entire towering, highly leveraged financial structure to dangerously tilt, loudly groan under the immense pressure, and eventually violently fracture into a million pieces. You absolutely must aggressively and intentionally condition your own mind right now to clearly see far past the immediate comforting illusion of fully stocked grocery shelves and temporarily stable retail prices. You absolutely must deeply recognize and internalize that the highly complex, massively interconnected nature of our modern globalized world makes it incredibly, exceptionally fragile to physical shocks. A sudden violent disruption in a single absolutely critical global transit node, exactly like the vulnerable Strait of Hormuz, instantly sends massive, cascading, unstoppable waves of highly destructive systemic failures rapidly ripping through international shipping lanes, global maritime insurance markets, massive Asian manufacturing hubs, and crucial, life-sustaining global agricultural centers. By the exact time that the mainstream financial media finally, begrudgingly acknowledges the true horrifying severity of the actual physical crisis, it will already be vastly, permanently too late for you to actively prepare. The underlying prices of highly essential, life-saving physical assets will have already violently gapped up completely out of your financial reach. The basic everyday availability of absolutely critical life-sustaining physical supplies will have already permanently vanished from the retail market. The heavily guarded doors to absolute financial and physical safety will be violently and permanently slammed completely shut in your face. This is exactly why you absolutely must deeply understand the complex underlying mathematical mechanics of this impending crisis today, right now, while the deceptive, rapidly evaporating temporal buffer is still barely intact. You currently have an incredibly narrow, rapidly closing window of personal opportunity to aggressively and permanently decouple your own personal microeconomy from the highly fragile, rapidly collapsing global macro system. This monumental, life-saving task absolutely requires a complete, ruthless, and entirely objective reevaluation of absolutely all of your current financial assets, your primary and secondary income streams, and your specific localized geographical vulnerabilities. You absolutely have to force yourself to ask the incredibly hard, deeply uncomfortable questions about exactly how your specific, chosen livelihood will actually survive in a dark, constrained world where basic energy costs rapidly and permanently triple and highly complex global supply chains completely and totally freeze up. You absolutely have to aggressively and permanently pivot your entire psychological mindset completely away from mindlessly maximizing financial yield in a highly stable, predictable environment to aggressively maximizing pure physical survival and immense personal optionality in a deeply unstable, highly volatile, and heavily constrained environment. The specific group of naive people who will undeniably suffer the absolute most horrific pain during this transition are those foolish individuals who stubbornly remain deeply anchored to the comfortable ghosts of the past, passively and pathetically waiting around for a magical, impossible return to a peaceful state of normal that is absolutely, definitively never coming back. They will helplessly and painfully watch their hard-earned purchasing power completely evaporate into thin air, their comfortable corporate jobs permanently disappear into the void, and their previously high standard of living violently plummet straight into the ground, all while hopelessly and foolishly wondering out loud why the government isn't stepping in and magically fixing the problem for them. But the harsh, undeniable truth is that the government absolutely cannot fix a massive, highly structural physical energy deficit. The absolute only single thing they can actually do is aggressively print more fake fiat money, which will only mathematically serve to make the resulting supply-driven inflation exponentially worse and far more destructive. The ultimate heavy responsibility for your own physical and financial survival now rests completely and entirely upon your own two shoulders. The entire global economic system is absolutely going to forcefully and violently reset. It is completely mathematically and physically unavoidable at this point. The rigid, immutable laws of physical thermodynamics and fundamental macroeconomics will absolutely not be denied or negotiated with by anyone. And when it resets, those who understood the underlying mechanics ahead of time don't just survive the transition, they position themselves within it.